Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm Dan, and this is Forlorn Hobbies. Hello and welcome back to the channel. In today's vlog, we are going on an adventure to the bleak and desolate lands inhabited by a peculiar folk. Now, that's enough about picking Tim up from Sheffield on the way, as our journey goes even further beyond into the unknown wastelands of northern England, where we hunt for a giant spoon because that other landmark is far less interesting. Although, for the life of me, I cannot remember the name of the place. I think it must be Sunderland, because that's all Richie, our host, ever goes on about, so no. No, of course, I'm talking about Newcastle. Well, Cramlington, to be precise, where our wonderful host Richie is hosting our annual campaign game, and we're going to have a great time hashing out our what-if 100 days. Now, in this video, I won't be going into much detail about the games themselves because Tim has done some battle reports which will be live on his Napoleonic Wargaming channel at some point in the next couple of weeks. So if you want to see the details of the game, I'd wait for then and check his videos out. So, on a bleak Friday night, I set off, leaving the comforts and security of Sherwood, to travel, first of all, to pick up Tim from Sheffield. Now, I committed the most schoolboy rookie error in my travel plans, in that I did not check to see if there was any Friday night football on. And, as it turns out, Sheffield United were playing at home, so I enjoyed a lovely slow crawl in to Sheffield to go and collect him. Now, once I picked him up, we could set off on our way even further north, and we had quite a lovely drive, except for a few profanities and ill comments made by Tim as we passed Leeds, being a true Sheffield lad that he is, and we proceeded without any further incident up to Cramlington. Now, the new rules for Middle-earth strategy battle game have recently been announced, so the car journey was pretty much a intense debate of our hopes and dreams of what the new edition will maintain, as we are both avid Middle-earth players and have been quite sceptical going forwards for the rules release, but the content of that is probably for another video. Now, after a long journey, we arrived at our hotel, only to discover that we were 5 minutes late for ordering food at the pub. But we had noticed that there was a shining bright McDonald's, so we weren't too bothered about that. Until we got to the McDonald's and it was closed for refurbishment. So we had to make do with a couple of pints and some crisps to state our hunger and thirst for the evening. Now, the Saturday morning, in contrast, started off much better, with a lovely cooked breakfast at our hotel. So with full stomachs, we decided to head over to Richie's unit, which would be the location for our games for the weekend, where a couple of the guys had already got there and were discussing plans for the day ahead, whilst others were obviously distracted elsewhere, being Greg's and more food and pasties, So they turned up a bit later with all their goodies in tow, although they didn't share. Uh, and then finally, our friend Mr. Crew from Tremontium Hobbies arrived in his rusty old banger, bringing several of his local gaming buddies with him to experience our weekend, and the fun could finally begin. Now, for those of you who follow Tim's Napoleonic Wargaming channel, you will probably know that we have been playing over the last couple of years a kind of what if 100 days campaign, mainly because Richie is obsessed with Quatre Bras and we wanted to move on from that instead of just playing Quatre Bras all the time. So the first live stream that Tim did was the Quatre Bras game, where the French kind of steamrolled their way through the British lines and even managed to kill the Duke of Wellington for some dodgy rolling. I believe it was Mr. Crew that was responsible for the death of Wellington under his control, because Richie was controlling the guards and just kept blundering his way. And I think there is a fantastic part of the second day of the live stream where Richie blunders with the guard, and then he's like, "Oh, I've got a reroll" in his thick Geordie accent, followed by a second blunder where he's just like, "Oh, for God's sakes, man!" And I have never found that, just in the background noise to be more entertaining. So I do kind of watch it back from time to time just for a little bit of light-hearted banter. Now, the second game that we played a year later was Ligny, which was a much bigger game, obviously, because the historical context of it. And again, the French had the upper hand. However, there wasn't as much of a decisive victory for them in this game, and there were a lot more players involved, so it was a great game, but it was kind of swinging from one end of the table to the other. Now, where I was, down the far end, the Prussians had the upper hand. Even though the French had taken some of the buildings, they were very much held up by Mr. Hardy of Vital Ground fame, who had his small Jaeger battalion that held up pretty much the entirety of the French heavy cavalry division, which was quite entertaining to watch. But up towards Tim's end, it was very much the French in control of the board, and then in the middle it was quite back and forth. So we kind of, after that game, we had a long kind of think about what realistically would have happened in the kind of process, because the British would not have fallen back to Mont Saint John, which is where Waterloo was, and the Prussians probably were in a much better position where they were than historically, and it made sense for the main French army to pursue the Prussians. Now, we kind of did it back and forwards where we'd have a kind of Waterloo kind of type scenario where the British would come to the aid of the Prussians, but it was kind of, do we want to play Waterloo again, but just kind of muddle the teams around, or kind of come up with a more distinct scenario? So obviously our planning was immaculate, and we were still deliberating this on the morning of the game. So we spent a good chunk of time discussing kind of what the French forces would be like, what kind of the Prussians would be doing, what the British would be doing, and we kind of settled on a pretty much a refight of Ligny, but not at Ligny itself. We had a couple of like kind of built up areas, and the river which the running through kind of most of the battlefield, which the Prussians were kind of using as their defensive point. and we decided that they would not be having British support because with Wellington dead, the army, which was amalgamated from various nations and backgrounds, so we weren't sure where the Dutch Belgians would be. They wouldn't fall back with the British, they'd probably go back to their own defensive positions or even turn sides. In the case of Nassau, we were like, yeah, the Nassau will probably jump ship, so the Nassau joined the French. Um, and the British would have probably just fallen back to Antwerp on their supply lines and gone back to Old Blighty. So the Prussians again were very much for themselves, and it was a good, fun game, very swingy in places. Um, the Guard were exceptionally commanded by Mr. Crew, but you'll have to see the battle report for the fate of them, to see whether they were successful or not. Because, as I said, I don't really want to ruin uh, your enjoyment of the battle reports themselves. Uh, but it was a great game. We had new players with us, so it was very fun for me to just sit there and kind of help these guys out. These are people that, in some cases, I've been talking to on Messenger and have been part of the group for years, but have been unable to get to games before, like Paul and other people that Ian's just brought along, and it's been great to get to know them. But I enjoy nothing more when we're playing big games than to kind of see newer players enjoy the game and be immersed in it. And I think it was quite successful in that regard. There was lots of entertaining moments to kind of hook them in, and I'll apologise in advance for the amount of painting and purchasing that they will probably be doing off the back of this game, although I do not take any responsibility for their expenditure. And then that was the Saturday. It was a very long but very fun game, and unfortunately Ian had to head back home, back across the borders, possibly something to do with his Scottish visa, perhaps, not being allowed to stay in England past certain times with his curfew. But no, I think he had a heresy game arranged for the evening, so he chugged back along the road back across the border, and we were very concerned that he would not actually make it home and would just be stranded because his car was in some state. But we got a message an hour or so later just to reassure us that he had in fact arrived home. And the rest of us had a great time at the pub. As you do with these things, it's all about having a nice, relaxing time, beers, some pub food, and some hearty, entertaining conversation with the rest of the guys. Now, Sunday morning, I was rudely awakened by a very loud alarm going off at about 6:30 in the morning, because some inconsiderate soul decided that they were illiterate and could not read the many, many warning notes that says, if you wish to shower, please shut the bathroom door, because the steam will set off the fire alarm. So all of the hotel guests had to traipse out in their half-asleep state and stand in the freezing cold car park whilst we waited for the firemen to arrive. Now, Tim made a lovely comment saying that if he'd had known that he was going to be rescued by 3 strapping Geordie firemen, he would have just stayed in bed. So, make of that what you will. However, given that we weren't meant to be meeting up until 10 o'clock, there was not much point in going back to sleep, so I amused myself by watching Match of the Day, and the highlight of that show was the fact that a Wolves fan decided to stand behind the goal in his underpants to try and distract the Bournemouth player from scoring a penalty. Make of that what you will about the standard of today's football. But I suppose it was still better than watching Newcastle play. Although Richie does have an unnatural interest in how Sunderland get on, so perhaps he's really a Sunderland fan in the closet. Now, again, another hearty breakfast, so ready for the day ahead and yet more discussions and waiting for people to go to Greg's. And we decided after a long deliberation that we would have a kind of British rearguard for the second game. So this would consist of a couple of elements of the British troops, some light cavalry, and we decided that the Hanoverians were probably the most expendable. So they were kind of the first obstacle for the French corps that was pursuing them to overcome. Now, again, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the game, but it was essentially a delaying tactic to ensure that their supply was covered and that they could retreat. And I think that was quite a successful kind of scenario that we came up with. And it was quite an enjoyable game with lots of funny moments blundering. So I blundered more than Tim, which is unheard of. However, I got the result that I was expecting on the blunder chart. So really, I was just, skilling that blunder to my advantage to get what I actually wanted from it. And Richie was, of course, hovering round other people's dice, so blunders for Mr. Hardy and his cavalry were, the same kind of experience, and it just made for an entertaining final game of the weekend. And because there was fewer of us, it was a bit easier to keep track of the game, and it wasn't as big, so we could have smaller elements, and it was thoroughly enjoyable. Now, at the end of the day, we obviously were discussing what next. Now, I think looking at the campaign, as much as I want Richie to have to buy a Russian and Austrian army, that realistically, I think it kind of ends similarly to how the 100 Days campaign did. That the French didn't really have the decisive enough victory that they needed to put Prussia and Great Britain out of the theatre of war. So it would basically be a repeat until that happened, and obviously the French can't really afford that with their resources and their supplies being quite stretched. So we kind of decided that although we may have a final game in the future, that it would be best to kind of just say, the French have got a couple of victories, but they're pretty much staring at the barrel of defeat because they haven't broken through and pushed out Britain entirely. Prussia is still very strong, and of course the other allies are going to be closing in. So it might be nice to explore some of the potential Russian or Austrian theatres of that war, but I think we're going to move away from Napoleonics for our next kind of big thing in the group. So some deliberating on that is happening as we speak. I think talk about kind of ancients, biblicals. El Cid is a popular one. Even Italian wars. Just something to mix it up a bit, where I hope that we can all as a group kind of come together and contribute an element of it just to be more invested, because as much as Richie's collection gives me extreme hobby envy, and that it's not fair, I think, from our group, even though Richie's happy to put up everything to play, that we all want to invest in our own hobby and we want to contribute. So perhaps we could make it a kind of like tale of gamers kind of thing leading up to it, which would be quite interesting to explore, where we each pick like an element. So let's take El Cid for example. We can go who's going to be Al Angelus, who's going to be Yusuf, who's going to be El Cid, Castile, Leon, Aragon, those kind of things, and then just work on a small section where we could even turn it into like a mini campaign amongst our own, like kind of regional gaming groups where we could play small skirmishes and build up to one big battle at the end. But we will see, because that's very much early days and in the works. So hopefully next year we'll have something a little bit different to be talking about. Now, for me, this kind of gaming weekend really emphasizes how important it is to have a good hobby community around you. Now, this group was made up of a bunch of people that went to the Great Game, and others have been added over time, like myself included, mainly because Tim needs a taxi and I am a mug. But no, I get to play great games out of it, and the community itself is very supportive. We each other's hobby, and we have a great time having lots of banter and sharing our hobby enjoyment with each other. And it's not always the same people that turn up to the big games, because obviously life is full of constraints, and but whoever's there is always great pleasure to see them, and I hope that we can continue to have these weekends for a lot longer to come, because it's always a great laugh, a great entertainment, and the motivation for each other to succeed is always a good driving force for the hobby. Now, in the next video, or next couple of videos, I will be hopefully trying to get out a few small projects. I've had a big box of goodies from Mr. Crew that were delivered from his printing friend JB, and I look forward to getting those out and doing some work on those, maybe in the next video, maybe the video after. We also have the release of the new Lord of the Rings film, and as a massive Middle-earth fan, I will probably do a review video on the film itself, as well as the new strategy battle game edition that is released alongside that. So hopefully we can get those videos out over the next couple of weeks, and then it's full steam ahead with the Prussians, not Prussians, God, yeah, I wouldn't, that's the forfeit, Prussians, God. Full steam ahead with my Russians for Under Eagles to Glory in March. Now, I have painted some models. I'm still in single figures, unfortunately, but I have worked out a paint scheme for them, and I have a lot prepped and undercoated, so I think I will be sick of the sight of them by the time they are done, but they are slowly working away in the background. Now, my plan with the updates for those is to do a video once I have finished a specific section. So once I've done the artillery, there will be a video for that. The infantry will probably be the last video that I release, because there is a ton of them. I think there's about 320 across my battalions that I need to paint. So, well, 312 now, as I have 8 done. But even though they should be first, they're probably going to be last because there is the most in them. However, I am happy to release a kind of how I paint the Russians video first, and then just do a smaller review later on once they're all done, if that is what people would prefer. Now, that's it for me today. So I hope you have enjoyed listening to my ramblings of this adventure that me and Tim had. And I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks, guys. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Until next time, enjoy your hobby.